Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tristan Mahabir. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Communications Network. I'm filling in for Sean Gibbons, our CEO, and the usual friendly face you would see here today. So channeling the spirit of Sean, let's start with the two-word check-in. If everybody could just drop your name and location in the chat and let us know how you're doing today. In 2 words, if you could, please. Now the holiday season is almost upon us, and I hope everybody's doing well and that everybody's healthy. So we have Colleen from Denver, curious and energized, same Colleen. Laura from Pittsburgh, sleepy and dreamy. Now they're coming in. So say hey to us, say hey to folks you might know, and we'll just wait for a few more people to get in the room. I think we had about 600 folks RSVP, so we're just gonna hopefully let everybody trickle in over the next minute or so and then keep moving forward. I have my colleague and friend Kareem Alston behind the scenes running our slides, and we have the lovely Kenya doing our ASL interpretation today. All right. Looks like we have almost 200 folks with us now, so that's great. Kareem, if you don't mind moving forward, we just have a few items to flag for you all, some things from the network, new and upcoming, just some updates. So first things first, we have a brand new comnetwork.org. That's largely thanks to Kareem, actually, who was the mad scientist who helped us build this. We try to make it easier than ever to help you all connect, gather, and inform. So let us know what you think. Comnetwork.org, that's it. Check it out. If you find any technical gremlins, also please let us know. But we hope it's a big improvement over what we've had. And we hope it looks nice too. Next slide, please, Kareem. This is coming soon. So to complement the new website, we're gonna have a new members community. So this is gonna be only for network members. So again, the idea is just making it easier for you all to connect with each other, share ideas, share information, ask questions, all that sort of stuff. So that's coming soon, early 2023. Next slide, please, Kareem. If you were with us in Seattle, you know that we're back to in-person ComNet, which I think everybody's very happy about. 2023, we're going down to Atlanta, and here's some good news. We've extended the early bird pricing through the end of this month. So you have until December 31st to get early bird pricing. That's for members and non-members. But if you become a member, you're going to save more than it costs you to become a member. So we encourage you to do that. It's likely that we're going to sell out sometime next year. So if you want to get your ticket early, we're going to have just a phenomenal program for you all down in Atlanta with some really cool stuff planned. Next slide. Circles, you all have heard this many times before, but it's your network within the network. So circles are organized around job function, identity, issue area, and you have your own dedicated Slack channel and monthly meetings over Zoom to have a really trusted, close-knit group of folks to help you with problems or questions, or really anything around those things that you want to talk about. So you can sign up at comnetworkcircles.org. It's grown a lot this year. We're going to be adding some new circles most likely. So if there's a circle you want, let us know. And this is also only for network members. Next slide, please, Kareem. ComNetwork Local, again, you know, pretty much anywhere you are in the country, there's likely a local group that's not too far from you. Many of our groups have resumed in-person events. Some are still doing virtual, some are doing hybrid. If you go to the URL below, you will see, excuse me, where you can sign up for your group's email list and stay tuned that way. You can also check out the leadership teams of each group if you want to get in touch with those folks. Next slide, please, Kareem. And this is going to segue into the conversation we're having today, but comnetworkdei.org. It's a wonderful, wonderful database and resource with case studies, tools, tips, all built to help you integrate DEI into your communications work, do that a little bit better. Niiobli, who's helping moderate our conversation today, was one of the folks who helped us build this. Tanya Barrientos as well, Bryan Simmons. We have a lot of good thinking that went into this, so please make use of it. We added a few things to it recently, so if you haven't looked at it in a while, there are a few updates. We'll be making more updates. So it's sort of a living database. So check it out from time to time, and there will be new stuff to help you integrate DI into your work. Next slide, Kareem. I think that might be it. So yep. With that, just a few other things before we get started. You can drop your questions down into Q&A, but we will be doing office hours as we've been doing. So at the end of the webinar, 30 minutes, we're going to drop a Zoom link into the chat. Click that. We're going to have unstructured Q&A with Niiobli and the rest of the team today. We have Tanya Barrientos from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Bryan Simmons from Arcus Foundation, and Kaniqua Welch from the Kresge Foundation all joining us today. We're super grateful. As I mentioned, we have Kenya doing ASL for us, and I think you can also enable a live transcript down below the CC button if you want to do that. We will be recording and posting this webinar on the network's YouTube channel. We'll get that up probably in a day or two after this concludes, so you can share it out, rewatch it, all that good stuff. And I think with that, I can pass it over to my friend Niiobli, who's going to lead a really rich conversation for us today. We're grateful for his time and the rest of our panelists' time. And with that, I will hand it over.
Thanks, Tristan. Glad to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Niiobli Armah of We-Collab. I'm principal and founder of We-Collab. Our pronouns are he, him, and I'm coming to you today from Houston, Texas, which is indigenous land of the Acknowledgements tribe that was in Galveston Bay in the Trinity River region of Texas. So excited for this discussion. So excited that this project continues to give you life and give the network life. Shout out to all the board members and teams that helped put it together. And today we're really pausing to figure out and talk to you about what we've learned and how can it be more useful. And before we dive into that rich dialogue, I am going to take a few minutes to kind of tell you what are updates you can expect and what have we learned. But before we do that, I just want to give everyone some space, because I looked at the chat, and a lot of people, there's a few that are excited and energized, but there's a lot of you who are cold, who are tired. And so everyone who's energized, I want y'all to just send some energy to all the people who are cold and tired. We know that this conversation is coming at a bookend. And if, like most of us on the call, this is the busiest time of the year. You're trying to squeeze so much in before you go to the holidays. And so any dialogue about equity or diversity and inclusion, I always make sure that we stop and just give time and make space. And the other thing I think is really important in dialogues around equity is, this notion always comes up, is that we're going to create a safe space. And I always pause everyone on that, because we haven't negotiated what safe means for you. So I'm not going to say that today's dialogue is going to be a safe space. What I can say is that our intent is to not cause harm. I am sure about our intent of the discussion. And so I don't know if this is going to be a safe space, because I don't know you all. But I do know that our intent for the dialogue today is to not cause harm. And so I hope that you fully show up. You can be fully present. If you're like me on most of the webinars I join, maybe close out the 2 emails, the holiday shopping list, the WhatsApp group with all your family members. I close some of those windows and just fully lean into the dialogue today. But I'm really excited that you're here and really excited to get to this panel. So to get us to the panel, before I do that, I have to tell you about updates. And so what we have found is that tools around DEI and equity are always put in the field, but they're not always updated. And yes, close the Amazon cart too. That's a real good one. But tools are put out in the field and they're not always updated. And so what we've been doing, and we collab with our partners and with the communications network, is really figuring out, how do we keep this DEI website fresh? How do we keep it relevant? So there's 3 things I want to point you to that you will notice that some of them are already done. A lot of these you can expect to see at the top of the year. So for design, we're actually trying to make it more user-friendly. There's so much rich tools in the website, and we want to make sure that within 1 to 2 clicks, you can get access to what you need. So one of the things you'll notice that we've added the glossary bar at the top. And so we want more simple navigation, so you can know where to find things. You can literally pull this website up, in a meeting and point to it. Even the glossary itself, we're still adding terms. There's a few things we missed. And so we're adding some ableism, because we know that the disability community often gets left out of these dialogues around equity. So ableism is going to be added to the glossary, and other terms relevant to that. We're going to also talk about assimilation. There's a lot of nuances around culture that we won't have a chance to talk about today, but we go straight to structural racism, and we don't ever stop and talk about cultural assimilation. So we're going to add that in there. We also know that the discourse has changed. Critical race theory needs to be added. There's still confusion about what it is and what it isn't. So we're going to put that in there as well. And there's a ton of other things. Linguistic hegemony is going to be in there, because we also know that all of us, English is not our first language. So if we're going to fully talk about equity and make sure that you have the tools to do DEI work in your organizations, we have to expand. So you can expect to see easier navigation at the top of the year. Some of those changes are already there. You're going to see an expanded glossary, because the discourse is constantly changing. And what's good about these glossaries is that there's no definitive source on use this word and not that word, but you do want to be aware on what's coming up. And so we have to make sure that we include that. And if you can think of other things that you haven't seen or want to see, feel free to reach out to Tristan. You're always more than welcome to reach out directly to We-Collab. We're always taking feedback, because in order for this to have impact in your organization, it has to stay relevant and it has to be present. And we know that the discourse is changing. The last thing that you're going to see on this website is expanded of case studies. People have actually took the website and implemented it. And so you're going to hear from Kaniqua at Kresge later on, but Kaniqua's case study is up about what the Kresge Foundation has done. They took a very detailed and full review of the toolkit and actually applied it in their organization. They had a whole management strategy where everyone on the comms teams deployed the tools. And Kaniqua's going to join us in the panel shortly and talk about exactly how she did that. And so again, there'll be more case studies to come. So the good news is that there's new things on there. It's going to be more user-friendly, and we're going to expand the glossary. And there's other, typos and grammatical errors that we're making too, because I know communication folks, there's a copy editor out there who is smiling because we're catching some of those mistakes. Second thing I want to talk about real quickly is about what we've been doing since the website has been up. So we've been actually, for the past 6-7 months, we've been talking to communication professionals either on one-on-one, getting real feedback. We've done a few small group sessions. Some of you on the call today joined. So thank you for the work that you did with this. And there's really about 6 things I just kind of want to blur out that we're learning and takeaways that are going to ground some of the discussion that we continue to have. And Nate from the We-Collab team, can you do a quick check to see if ageism is on there? I don't know off the top of my head, but if it's not, we should put it up there. And can we also, Nate, let's just drop in the website. Oh, it's actually there at the 1212 mark. The comnetworkdei.org site is there. So I want to make sure you have it in front of you if you're not familiar with it. But I want to just tell you some of the things we've learned that are really, really important. We're going to reference this in the dialogue as we move there shortly. So first thing we learned is that participants feel that there's so much richness on there about the external work of equity. And what we heard over and over again is that the difficulty for the communication professionals rests with internal staff. So the internal communications piece, people are understanding how to engage community and understand how to use asset-based language, but they're in institutions where everyone hasn't done some equity work. Everyone hasn't done inner work. And so people are enjoying the tool, but they're asking ourselves, how do I implement this tool if I'm in an organization that is not doing justice to this work? So we're definitely going to get into that later, but we heard a lot of comments about that. The other thing that we heard is that, related to the first, is that white dominant culture is still prevalent in the social impact space. And we have to acknowledge that and make sure that we distinguish between describing the characteristics of white dominant culture without demonizing like white people. Like this work is not anti-white, it's anti-white dominant culture, but people of color, white people, everyone, orientation, no matter where you were born, we all have a role to play in this work. And it's also important to mention that because you're a person of culture doesn't mean that you're not reinforcing white dominant culture. So you have to, some of this is more kind of experience, kind of 3.0, 4.0 work, but it is something that we've been keeping our ear to because people have said, hey, not only is my organization not doing the work, but there's also white dominant culture that's very present in these spaces that hasn't been addressed. And so there's been questions about that. Another finding from some of these rich discussions is that there's just a struggle to get buy-in for this work and respect for the expertise of the communication professional when they sit outside of the programmatic or issue-specific teams. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, about how do you really get your footing and make sure that your colleagues in the C-suite and on the program side and the grants management office side really respect the expertise that communication professionals are bringing. You all may not be experts in equity work, but you are experts in communication, which is why this tool is designed to kind of meet you halfway. And we want to make sure that you have buy-in with your colleagues. Two other quick things before I tee up the panel is that there's consensus that some professionals feel that they need training or framing around this. And so it's great to have a tool, but people want to practice skills. They want to know like what are the ins and outs. If this isn't your orientation, everyone on this call is aware that the interesting thing about equity work writ large is that it's not the default anywhere. Like if you're in an institution who's choosing to do this work, it's because they're choosing to. It's not baked into our society. Many of you didn't get classes on this in communication schools. You didn't learn it growing up in high school. And so there's a wealth of information out there, and folks need to be trained and grounded on it. And they have to look for opportunities to build their skills. And there's just consensus that needs to be ongoing. And then the last one is that this is my favorite one because it's the impetus for the entire project, is that honing in on the power of the communicator. Like you all have so much power, and we always talk about power in the context of community and centering communities. I want to talk about institutional power. Like whether you know it or not, you have the ability to shift the entire organization based on the words you use and how you tell stories and how you hold space for narrative and how proximate you get to the issues that you serve. And so I want to make sure that the biggest takeaway from this is that the communicator is still positioned well to move the needle on racial equity in spite of all the barriers and institutional challenges that may be facing. And we hope that this tool and this dialogue today helps you get more prepared to do that work and to lean into that power. So with that said, I am going to tee up our panel. We're going to do some office hours. If you have questions or stay to the very end, we can take really specific questions. There's lots more that we've learned, but I'm going to bring our panel on. And so first, we're going to bring on Tanya Barrientos. She's the Director of Executive Communications at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Next, we're going to bring on Bryan Simmons. He's the Communications Vice President at the Arcus Foundation. And then lastly, we're bringing on Kaniqua Welch, the Communications Officer at the Kresge Foundation. Thank you, all three of you, for joining today. It is a busy, busy season. Trying to get a lot done. And you're like, you know what, ComNet, I have time for 90 minutes to talk about this work because it's important in spite of this year. And I'm familiar with all the work they've done. I'm a huge fan of all of your organizations and just really, really excited about this discussion. And so I'm going to put us right in there because, you know, the clock is going to like wind down and we're going to be on question 2 and people are going to want more and then the Zoom is going to end. And so I want to dive right in. And Tanya, I'm going to come to you first. I mean, I want to talk about, you know, we have the website, we have the tool, but the real question is like, how do we keep this conversation active and present around racial equity? We know that it gets hijacked by things in the larger public discourse, but in the social impact sector, how do we make sure that people are continually re-energized to engage in this dialogue? What has been your experience at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation?
Well, we've been fortunate to have real buy-in by the CEO. So when you have leadership from the top, really centering these issues, it's a privilege, really. And so we are lucky in that aspect. But that said, you know, news can take over and people get distracted. And so what we've done is we recently hired a VP for equity and culture and have tasked her with creating a framework to establish equity as part of our culture in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This has included the board, which I think if I'm most proud of anything, it's the fact that we have been consistently presenting training and understanding and equity experts to our board of trustees on a really regular basis. Every time they meet, there's some sort of session. We've created a staff and trustee work group that are looking at our grant making process and the equity issues in our grant making process together. So that's one way I do think you can keep it going within the culture. The most important thing I think is to, as you said, to make sure that this doesn't end up being a communications project, that it has to be disseminated into programming, into contracting, into your investment side. This has to become an organization-wide ethos, I believe.
Yeah. Bryan, I'm coming to you next. Tanya, I want to come back to you though. I want to plant a seed. You mentioned that you all are doing work with your board, and that can be really challenging. So if there's any lessons learned about how you all got oriented and got the board in that place, we'd love to hear about it. But Bryan, why don't you jump in and tell us how you've kept the conversation present?
Well, I think you're going to find a lot of commonality between my comments and Tanya's. First of all, for those who don't know, the Arcus Foundation's two bodies of grant-making work each have embedded in them a real strong thread of DEI. We have a very strong racial dimension to our LGBTQ grant-making, and we also, in our conservation work, which is most of what we fund takes place in Southeast Asia and in Africa. And so we have to contend with the legacy of colonialism, both in conservation, which has been dominated by white Westerners, a sort of narrative of white Westerners coming to Africa and patting people on their heads and telling them how to preserve their forests and their wildlife and so forth, and having an unsatisfactory level of respect for grassroots conservation. And there's a big movement there to show more respect and more involvement relative to indigenous peoples in those places. So we're talking about these issues a lot at Arcus all the time. And that in the context sometimes of us actually making sure we pay attention to the power dynamic between those who bring the funds to a particular geographic area and the communities there. But where I see the real commonality between how we've approached this and what Tanya was saying is that we do have the support of our CEO, we have the support of our board, that these issues are on their minds, but there are the distractions. Even when everyone is really well-intentioned, you just find yourself in situations where there's the imperative of the moment and everything is hurried and people kind of give themselves a little break because they're under pressure. But what we've been doing is really trying to ritualize this as much as possible, where every conversation that we have, whether it's when we're having early conversations about our annual report and what will be in it, or we're working as communications in partnership with the grant management team to think about our client service initiatives, how we take care of our grantees through the compliance process, through the reporting process, how we communicate when we are publishing a request for proposals, thinking about language and localization and translation, what we put out there in Spanish, what we put out in French, always asking the question, who's not in this room for this conversation? And what would they say if they were here? This just happened during a very important conversation last week. So really take the beachhead for our communications team, and I really want to be clear, I don't want to pretend that in my organization, for sure, that we are the leaders or the only ones who really care and we're getting everyone to go along with us. Every team in Arcus is thinking about these things, but our partnership with HR, all the way down to job postings and what they look like, our data gathering partnership with grants management so that when we do our CEP survey, we are looking for even the nuances within very positive responses from women and people of color to see if their experiences or their perception of how well we are taking care of them or how we communicate with them is different, and trying to get underneath why that is. All of those partnerships where we are ritualizing those questions and trying to establish some facts on which we can act and change our practice to address. That's what we have been doing. And right now, just as is mentioned in the tool, we're working on a style guide that is going to give all of our staff something that they can hold on to and put into practice in terms of words they choose, how they convene, how they conduct meetings. It's not just about editing and that sort of printed style, but voice and casting and who's included and who is invited, all this. So I think I've been talking long enough. I could go.
You're giving all the nuggets. I'm like, yes. Tanya, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yes, I want to jump in just because, Bryan, we just created a writing style guide. It took us 2 years to put it together because we were incredibly conscious about equity language and non-binary type terms. And we just finished it actually. And we now have sent a copy to everyone on staff, and the whole first 3 pages are about equity language. That's about asset framing. It's about bias-reduced language. It's about thinking before you speak, thinking about, as you said, who's not in the room. It took us a long time to get here, but we're pretty proud of it. And we've made very clear to staff that this is a living document and will be changed a lot, because already, for real quick example, like there was questions about Latinx versus Latin, and that's something that, we haven't quite landed yet, but we tell people that just, keep up. And we're dropping little word plays and quizzes into our weekly internal newsletter. So it'll be top of mind for the staff, and ends up not just sitting on someone's desk. So we're trying to get people into the muscle of actually using it.
Totally. So Kaniqua, we're coming to you in a minute, but a few nuggets that we just have to stop and acknowledge. So one, Bryan, just thank you for what you mentioned about colonialism, because people doing work in international settings often don't feel like they have the same equity tools as when we're only talking about the domestic USA. And we know the legacy of colonialism is rich, and we have to prepare folks who have portfolios that are abroad with tools. And so thank you for that. Other thing I want to just say, when I'm looking at the chat, any style guide that's public, we definitely can figure out how to get the links out to you all. Sometimes style guides are internal, but Tanya, anything that you have that's external, like let us know so we can leak it. You all know good artists steal, or great artists steal. I'm probably messing up the quote. And so if you don't have, it shouldn't take you 2 years. If it took RWJ 2 years, because you can take the outline, etc. And there's something else that both of you said as I'm getting ready to come to Kaniqua that's important. So you all started off talking about leadership, which is an adaptive skill. And then you all talked about some technical things like in grant banking and processes. And everyone doesn't have a C-suite or leader who has said go. And so I'm going to go to Kaniqua, but then I want to come back to Bryan and Tanya. What is your advice for people who don't have C-suites who have said go? And then we'll revisit that. But Kaniqua, so before you come off mute, let me all tell you all something. And I don't have any favorites. I love everybody. But Kresge did, like when consultants create tools, our best case scenario is that someone will use them. Like that's what we go to sleep at night hoping for. And Kaniqua, what you all did is you all took the DEI website, you took every single tool and did an audit of all of your practices. And so shout out to you all for doing it. But can you tell us like what that process was like and how that process has helped you keep an ever-present conversation in your organization?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Bryan. And thank you, Bryan and Tanya, for all of the nuggets that you shared so far. I mean, I really have to give a shout out to our full communications team, especially Krista Yankee, who I co-authored the case study with. But really, our full team took a deep dive into this toolkit. And, Krista is the one who brought it to us. And we all decided we were going to really dissect this toolkit, look at it, assess where are we as a foundation, also as a communications team, and how we're integrating DEIJ into our comms work. So, we took your recommendations and we split up into teams. We have an 11-person communications team, and we did an assessment of where we are, right? Based on your recommendations. What type of content are we developing and where we want to be? What type of content do we want to develop? When people come to Kresge's website, when you look at our different communications channels, are we really lifting up our values through our comms work? And just expounding a bit on your first question of, how we keep this as an ever-present conversation. I mean, for anyone who is unfamiliar with Kresge, this is a national philanthropic organization that's rooted in creating opportunities in America's cities. We know that cities are where the most marginalized voices are, right? So racial equity is a baseline for our work. And we think about the grant-making side, right? Our colleagues on the grant-making side and in social investments, like they're funding the organizations that's doing this very important work. And we at Kresge and the communication side, right? We get to talk about it. We get to elevate it through our different comms channels. And I think, one way we've been doing a pretty good job of that is having the conversations, simply starting with the conversations. When we took a deep dive into the toolkit, it forced us to talk about some stuff that was a little uncomfortable, right? That there are some audiences that don't want to talk about racism. And how do we still engage those audiences that don't want to talk about racism, to keep them included in the conversation? And we had to make the decision that it's an important topic. If we're true to our mission and we're true to the work that we're doing, we have to talk about it, right? And similar to Tanya and Bryan, I mean, top down, bottom across Kresge, racial equity is a priority. You will see it in the commentary from our president and CEO. You'll see it in the work that we share on our communications channels. So it's not very difficult for us to make this a priority because it's not difficult to make it a priority from a communications perspective because it's a priority across the board. I remember interviewing one of my recent colleagues. I was a part of an interview panel. Her name is Yo, if she's on the call. And during her interview, she called me out as the comms person. She said, I've looked at your website. Like, the content looks great. It really does. But are you really walking the talk? All right. Does your president and CEO just talk about this stuff, or is he really about it? Your program teams, are you really, really about it? And I could say with confidence, yeah, we really are. And now she's been with Kresge for several years and she agrees, like, yeah, okay, yeah, we really are. So I think it's being true to not just putting this content up on your website just for the sake of doing it, not just taking a deep dive into the toolkit for the sake of doing it, but being really, really serious and intentional with what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's so important. And I mean, for those of you on the call who are managers and leaders who have teams you're responsible for, like, gone are the days where you can just give this stuff surface, like just say the good stuff. Like, you are going to get called out either externally or internally. We know that the dynamics of the workforce are different and the Z's are relentless. And so the Z's will come for you if you put a statement out there, but then they don't feel it in how the organization operates. And often we talk so much about the skills and the tactics to do externally without ever saying, but you have to actually go through the change process. Like, you have to have the tough discussions. You have to have those different moments where some people in the organization are really questioning why. You have to really take the time and invest and explain why, because everyone doesn't know why. They should, but they don't. And so that's important to do. Tanya and Kaniqua, feel free to jump in on this next question. But Tanya and Bryan, I want to come back to you all because There are places in the country where this work is still challenging. There are national forces that don't want this work to happen, and people on this call don't have leaders and CEOs like you two. And so, what is your advice for folks who are trying to do the work and they don't have leadership kind of charging along? Like what would you tell them to do to just get started?
One of the things, and I think Kaniqua mentioned it, was I think you need to lean on the values of your organization. I think what you need to do is go to the board, go to the CEO, and underscore the values that you're trying to live. And then gently say, are we living those values in today's way, right? These values may have been created generations ago, depending on who founded your organization or when you were established, and maybe the values have just sort of continued and there was a different definition of them. But in today's world, what does that value look like? And are we living up to the intent of this organization? And I think that that's a less threatening way to approach this than saying, you know, we all have to be woke or whatever people are afraid of, right? But everyone is working with good intention at our organizations. And so I think the question has to be raised, are our good intentions being defined the way they need to be defined today? That's how I would approach it.
And I completely agree with Tanya. And I think to complement that approach, I think it's important to be evidence focused in how you begin. If you're dealing with with resistant leadership, and you make the case that Tanya just outlined about aligning with values, it has to be, in order to get your leadership to move forward, it's probably going to take, if they're resistant, it's going to take more than your assertion. It may not be able to move as fast as you would like. But if you take a step back and say, what data could we collect that would allow me to make a stronger case that we need to pay attention? Because there are there's hardly any group that any of us is working in that doesn't have in its brief to serve women or Black and brown people or disabled people or non-English speaking people or Indigenous people. So when you start the conversation there with your leadership and you gather data about how those people are experiencing you or feeling served by you, and then you can actually, even with the smallest bit of data, say, I see an area here where we need to improve in order to do what we have promised. You can start small with that and get them on board in many instances, I believe. So I think having a focus on evidence and a focus on values, as Tanya outlined, is a great place to start, even if you have to start small.
Yeah, I'll add something to that, Kareem. So I have the honor of wearing two hats at Kresge, both as a communications officer, but also as co-chair of our equity task force. And our equity task force is this 13-person cross-departmental team, that's just really been charged with supporting overall learning across the foundation, skill development, but just identifying how we can operationalize equity across the foundation. And something that we did is we consulted with an external partner, right? And that could be a recommendation too, that, sometimes internally, there could be groupthink, there could be difficulty with a person feeling comfortable with, or feeling uncomfortable with challenging the systems of hierarchy that exist in these organizations, right? So sometimes there's value in bringing in an external partner. And, we had an external partner to come in and do a survey of all staff, but not just a survey, but to do some one-on-one interviews with executive team members, with, folks really across the foundation to help assess where we are in terms of operationalizing equity in our work. And it's been very, very valuable and beneficial. So I offer that advice too, that sometimes bringing on external consultants can help. And also just knowing too that communications is a very, very important function with any organization, right? We are the folks who are charged with storytelling. We're the folks who are charged with, lifting up voices across the foundation and really talking externally about what we do. So I would say to all the comm folks too, like, know your value and, do not succumb to groupthink and just following the norm. Sometimes it is your responsibility as the communications person to do the professional pushback, and pushback is a good thing. It's appreciated, and just know that you're bringing value to the conversation as a communications person, and don't lose sight of that.
I'd like to add one other potential strategy also, and this may be a bit of an extension of what Kaniqua you were just saying, and that is that I think most of when we've been using the word leadership and talking about our potentially resistant leader, I think we mostly have been implying the CEO or the executive director. But there are other people in the leadership who can play a really important role, the CFO or the COO, for example, because what we are talking about, we've been talking about it really in the context of values and the moral imperative of it. But there is an organizational, institutional imperative of it in the context of risk. And if you can also bring this up in the context of reputational risk or crisis communications risk, because when we don't pay attention to these concerns, there's the potential that it will cost the institution and disrupt its mission by precipitating a crisis that's reputational and bring everything to a halt. So, and I think that a lot of organizations are increasingly being advised by their auditors, in fact, to really do a multidimensional risk analysis and assessment each year, from reputation to being resilient in the face of technology and hacking and all that sort of thing. So I think that's another tool in the kit as well.
But Bryan, you're throwing me an alley-oop with your statement here, because my next question is, there's the report that Edelman and Independent Sector put out called Trust in Civil Society. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. And maybe Nate, we could drop it here. But what's interesting is that there's a few entities we know the public doesn't trust. They don't trust the government and they don't trust big business. And there's a list of the most trusted institutions, which small businesses are on. But what's interesting is that philanthropy is on there as one of the most trusted institutions. And so I guess a question I have for you all is like, what is this philanthropic and the social impact sector, how do they be better stewards of that trust? Like, this is a really interesting finding that we usually don't think about the general public in terms of the audience, but if the general public is placing trust in the philanthropic and social impact sector, how do we be better stewards of that trust? Tanya, go ahead.
Well, one thing that we're leaning on is, well, first of all, if you don't know who the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is, we're the nation's largest philanthropy that focuses solely on health and health equity. And our CEO is Dr. Richard Besser, who used to be a medical correspondent on ABC News before he got into philanthropy. And he is, if I can say it, and he would agree, he's the poster boy for white privilege. He was born into a family of generations of doctors. He was raised in Princeton, New Jersey. He went to fancy schools, and he has embraced this learning journey wholeheartedly and has been very transparent about his own journey and learning. And so that brings me to exactly what I wanted to say here is that we are taking the privilege that he has as a white man. And at first he was very reluctant to talk about equity because he kept saying, who am I to talk about this? But we basically said, you are the person who needs to talk about this because you can get into rooms that other people can't get into. And if you don't talk about it, then it just won't be brought up. And so that's one of the steps we've decided to take, is to use our leverage, not only as a national foundation that's highly respected within the healthcare field, but also our CEO's very much white privilege to go into and make people feel uncomfortable a little in some rooms where he has gone into with healthcare executives at the National Academies of Medicine. And he's raised the topic and has made people feel a little queasy about it, but he feels that that's his role and that that's what he can do with his privilege. So that's one approach.
I'm so glad you said that, Tanya, and Kaniqua and Bryan, I want your opinion on what I'm about to say. I don't think we talk enough about the role, like let's just be really, really real. Like, this work usually sits with the person of color or the person who has the identity that historically has been marginalized. And if we're really, really serious about moving the needle, white, straight, executive, et cetera, men, baby boomers, like we can go on and on. Like, we have to expand the voices in this work. Like, if we're going to do systems change at the population level in our country. And I'm just curious about your perspectives on, like, how do we get this expansion to happen? Like, it can't always be like the people of color, the Kaniquas, the Tanyas, the Bryans. Like, we need the CEOs, like, as allies or whatever you want to call them, like, also in this work. Like, what do y'all think about, like, how do we grow that expansion of folks leaning into this work?
Yeah, I can add some thoughts. One thing that I really appreciate about Kresge's culture is we do not view ourselves as the experts, right? Our grantees and our partners who are on the ground doing the work, they are the experts. And a part of our responsibility is to listen to them because they are closest to the challenges, therefore they are closest to the solutions. So I think that that's one way, like, to, build up that trust with philanthropy, is, making sure that we're lifting up our grantee partners as the experts who are doing this work, right? And not necessarily us. Now, of course, we do have folks internally with expertise in certain areas. And another way is using our platforms. And to Tanya's point, is using the privilege that we have as this national foundation that's widely respected. How do we use that platform to talk about these issues? Similarly, our president and CEO, Rip Rapson, he will talk very explicitly about white supremacist systems. He's a white man, right? And one of the things that we did with our DEI toolkit recommendations is we developed an executive visibility strategy, basically outlining, identifying several folks across the foundation who will very intentionally use their voices to talk about the challenges that we're seeing in terms of racial equity across this country and how it's impacting people. And we were very intentional with not just picking people of color, right? Because we know that we can't just have people of color talking about these issues. We need white men, we need white women. And again, for Kresge, this wasn't a hard challenge. One of our managing directors, Lois DeBecker, is over our environment program. We all know that climate change impacts communities of color first and worst. And she has no issue talking about the fact that racism plays a very, very, very strong role in the challenges that we're seeing in the communities that we serve, right? So it's, getting our white colleagues, Black colleagues, everyone needs to be talking about this because it's not just a people of color issue. Like, racial equity is an all of our issue. And I think that, I was having a conversation with some colleagues not too long ago, and they are both white women. And, they said, sometimes it's a little uncomfortable for us to talk about these things because we don't want to get it wrong. right? And we don't want to be called out for getting it wrong. So I think that we also need to have some grace for our colleagues who are not of color, and for those of us who are of color, because we all make mistakes, right? We all are learning and growing together, but we need to have a little bit of grace, with making sure that people feel comfortable enough to show up in these spaces. And when they make mistakes, it's an opportunity for learning and not an opportunity to critique.
Yeah, huge takeaway. I just want to lean into that about giving folks grace, because what we all know is that this is no longer optional. This is the way forward. Like, it's not, you can say the moral argument, you can use the business case, but like DEI is here to stay. Like it is. Maybe we should have a new header on the website that says DEI, ... It is. But because we know that, we do have to exercise grace, and we have to figure out how to be bridge builders, and there's if you want to be a bridge builder, you have to sometimes come up out of yourself and say, okay, if I'm gonna be a bridge builder, I may be triggered in this moment by what you just said, but the communities that we serve, them being served outweighs me being triggered right now. So I am gonna lean and give you grace. And there's a balance here, because what we're talking about is extending grace, but then also making sure that we don't cause harm to ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we know doing this work in institutions, we can be harmed. And so there's this dance we have to do of giving grace, protecting self, and then like serving the outward goal. And I don't think any of us have like the three takeaways to do that well, but I just want to say that's the work. Like, how do I have grace while protecting myself by being true to the people we serve? And if you can do that in your organization, then you'll be the light that bring other people to it, because it is hard. Okay, we have a lot of really good questions in the chat. We're supposed to be transitioning to Q&A. So I'm gonna attempt to super facilitate this and get us through it. There's one question I do want to bring into the dialogue immediately, because I just really liked it. I have to scroll up to look for it. It was a question, so I can't find it, but it was a question around, oh, here it goes. Can we talk about the difference on white allies versus white change agents? And Jane, I think I understand, but I'm gonna yield to the panelists to lean into that question. Just the difference between white allies versus white change agents.
Well, I'm going to guess at what that distinction is, because it's not completely clear to me, but it is provoking me to think about some dialogue I've had with some colleagues and people outside my workplace about this. Allies could potentially be people who are not actively involved in the work, who are supportive. They're not impeding the work. They might be writing a check, but they're not speaking. They're not acting. Whereas change agents are looking for opportunities to actually move something themselves, and put their hands on the wheel, or their arms on the boulder. And I think implicit in that is maybe a larger discussion about this notion of a lot of us funders talk about funding work that is by and for the communities that are affected. And it's an ongoing dialogue. Should the funder or the white man with the money be silent, write the check and be silent because they can't speak for those communities? Or should they find a way to be a more active partner? So I think the tension in that comment in the chat provides a goal for some tension we need to resolve, so that you really don't have people who are simply allies, but not change agents. My view is that everyone should be a change agent, and that we should wrap all of the spokespersons we coach, the colleagues with whom we have dialogue about these issues from day to day. We should actually be trying to get to a place where it's everybody owns the work, and everybody owns the fact that this work, let's just assume it'll never be done. and we'll all have to keep working at it. And that there's not a group of people who've mastered the curriculum and everyone else is catching up. The fact is, and I think this is a pretty much a US-centric conversation that we're having based on who's on this Zoom right now, that we are all Americans almost before we are Black or brown or white. The one thing that we all in this landscape have in common is that we're all Americans, and the same media and messages and narrative have been washing over all of us our entire lives, regardless how we identify, and have been washing over our ancestors for hundreds of years. So it's sort of, the problems we're trying to solve constitute a sickness that we're all trying to recover from together. So when we contextualize these conversations that way, we can break down this distinction between allies and change agents and have everyone be a change agent. And wherever we can make our communications support that notion, I think we can, that's also very helpful. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Tanya, Kaniqua, I want to hear from you. So Robert in the chat has a good question I want to bring into the space. There's lots of good questions. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but he's asking what's the difference between people being uncomfortable and giving grace compared to coddling white guilt?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I'm happy you asked it, Robert. I think the most important thing is to be very direct when you're having these conversations, to approach them from a place of learning and not judgment, and to realize that there's an opportunity for us to learn from one another. I share this story frequently, that I remember working with a woman who very vocally talked about voting for Donald Trump. And I was just like, oh my God, how am I going to engage in a conversation with this woman, right? Because our viewpoints are so different. But I decided to still engage in the conversation because I really wanted to hear her viewpoint. And I wanted to try to understand where this woman is coming from. And we both, because I approached that conversation as a learner, like, I'm going to learn. I want to listen and learn as this person is speaking, although we are very, very different and we have very, very different viewpoints. And I want to give this person an opportunity to listen and learn from me. And we both did that. And that woman expressed a lot of white guilt as we were talking. I think that it's very much okay to say to a white person who approaches you and it feels like white guilt that I don't have the energy to hold this right now, right? And then if there are moments where you do have the energy to engage in the conversation, give the energy to the conversation. I just think the most important thing is, like, DEIJ work it's not comfortable. So we're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations, and we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with calling out white guilt, doing it in a safe space. We have to be okay with just being very direct and, letting people know when they do make mistakes. I think a big difference, especially when I think about colleagues and friends who are white that I've had these conversations with, is I've been very, very comfortable with saying, I don't have the energy right now to even, give you what you need. But also I appreciate the fact when they approach me with a question or they approach me with something they're not comfortable with, and I answer it in, again, a way that it's not judgmental. It's not meant to critique. I think that might be the bottom line of it too. Like, approaching these spaces, these conversations from a place of being able to learn from one another, because we're not experts. No one is, the official expert in this space. Like, there's an opportunity for us to learn from one another. So, that's my take on it. I hope that's helpful, Robert.
Thank you for everyone who came today. This tool continues to add value, and I'm so excited about the continued work that we're going to be doing with comment.